take a deep breath and allow the noise of the day to slowly fade away. Tonight, we're not exploring loud battles or dramatic revolutions. Instead, we're drifting into something far quieter and far more powerful. While most of the world was asleep in candle, lit villages and stone cities, a series of small, ordinary medieval decisions were being made. No one announced them. No one realized they mattered. Yet these choices, made in monasteries, marketplaces, farms and royal halls, slowly reshaped how we live today. How laws work, how time is measured, how society survives. This is a story about change without noise, power without drama, and history that moved so slowly that even the people living through it never noticed. So get comfortable. Let your thoughts drift. You don't need to stay fully awake to understand this story, because tonight as you rest, we'll gently uncover how the medieval world quietly changed everything, one unnoticed decision at a time. In the medieval world where life moved slowly and decisions were often made without any sense that they would echo across centuries, a series of quiet choices ended up reshaping politics, religion, science, and everyday human life in ways no one at the time could fully imagine. When a group of English barons forced King John to seal the Magna Carta in 1215, their intention was not to create democracy or human rights as we understand them today, but simply to protect their own privileges from royal abuse. Yet that single concession planted the idea that even a king could be subject to law, an idea that would slowly grow and influence constitutional systems across the world. Around the same period, monasteries quietly made another world, changing choice by continuing to copy ancient Greek and Roman texts during long winters, not out of a desire to spark a future scientific revolution, but because preserving knowledge was seen as a religious duty. These manuscripts later fueled the Renaissance and ensured that thinkers like Aristotle and Euclid were not lost to history. In the East, the decision of Emperor Constantine centuries earlier to found Constantinople, as a new imperial capital, continued to shape medieval geopolitics, as the city became a bridge between Europe and Asia, preserving Roman administrative systems while absorbing Eastern influences. And when it finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, scholars fleeing westward carried precious texts that accelerated intellectual change in Europe. Meanwhile, medieval farmers across Europe gradually adopted the heavy plough and the three-field crop rotation system, not as part of any grand plan, but simply to survive harsher climates. This increased food production, supported population growth, and allowed towns, trade guilds and universities to emerge, quietly laying the groundwork for modern urban society. In the realm of religion, a seemingly technical disagreement over church authority led to the Great Schism of 1054, dividing Christianity into Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic branches, a split that hardened cultural identities and political alliances across Europe and the Near East for centuries. Another understated yet revolutionary decision occurred when Johannes Gutenberg combined existing technologies, movable type, oil-based ink, and the printing press, into a practical system. He was trying to run a business, not start a communication revolution. But the ability to mass produce books broke the monopoly of knowledge held by elites, accelerated literacy, and allowed ideas to spread faster than ever before, eventually making religious reform and scientific debate unstoppable. In England, the gradual development of common law shaped case by judges rather than imposed as a fixed code, created a flexible legal tradition that would later influence legal systems far beyond medieval Europe, including in places that would not even exist as nations for hundreds of years. Far to the south, medieval Islamic scholars made decisions that would deeply affect global knowledge, choosing to translate, study, and expand upon Greek, Persian, and Indian works in centers like Baghdad and Cordoba. Their advancements in algebra, medicine, astronomy, and optics later flowed back into Europe, forming the intellectual backbone of modern science. Even warfare was quietly transformed by medieval choices, such as the increased use of longbows in England, which weakened the dominance of armoured knights and slowly undermined the feudal system, shifting power away from hereditary elites toward centralized states. The founding of universities in places like Paris and Bologna was another subtle turning point, as these institutions standardized education, encouraged debate, and produced administrators and thinkers who would shape governments and churches alike. Trade decisions also mattered deeply. The growth of merchant leagues and banking families normalized credit, contracts, and long-distance commerce, changing how wealth functioned and making capitalism possible long before the term existed. Perhaps most quietly of all, medieval people began keeping records: births, deaths, land ownership, taxes, not to help future historians, but to manage daily life. And these habits of documentation created the data-driven governance systems that modern states still rely on. None of these medieval decisions were made with a clear vision of the modern world in mind. They were practical responses to immediate problems, shaped by faith, fear, ambition, and survival. Yet together, these small, often unnoticed choices bent the direction of history, proving that the world is not always changed by loud revolutions or famous battles, but by ordinary decisions made in candlelit rooms, monastery, scriptoria, village fields, and royal courts, whose consequences only become visible when centuries have quietly passed. As the medieval centuries unfolded, more quiet decisions continued to ripple outward, shaping the world in ways that felt invisible to those living through them. When merchants chose to follow established routes like the Facehook Road Fay, they were simply seeking profit and safety in familiar paths. Yet those choices stitched together distant civilizations, allowing not only silk and spices to travel, but also ideas, technologies, religions, and diseases, creating a deeply interconnected world long before globalization had a name. The decision by rulers and city councils to grant charters to towns, allowing a degree of self-governance, quietly weakened feudal bonds, and encouraged a new identity centered on citizenship rather than birth, an idea that would slowly mature into modern civic life. During times of crisis, medieval responses often reshaped society permanently, as seen when communities reacted to the Fey Black Death, Fey by adjusting labour laws and wages. With workers suddenly scarce, peasants gained bargaining power, and the rigid social hierarchy that had defined medieval life began to loosen, setting Europe on a path toward social mobility and economic change. In monasteries and workshops alike, craftsmen made small but meaningful decisions to refine tools, clocks, and mechanical devices, gradually improving timekeeping and productivity, which altered how people structured their days and understood the value of time itself. Rulers, seeking more efficient taxation and control, slowly replaced personal loyalty with bureaucratic administration, relying on written records and trained officials, a shift that transformed kingdoms into early nation-states. Religious orders, by choosing to emphasize education and preaching, spread literacy beyond monasteries and into towns, allowing ordinary people greater access to moral, philosophical, and eventually political ideas. Even architectural choices mattered deeply. The preference for stone cathedrals and fortified castles was driven by durability and defense, yet these structures became symbols of authority and community identity that still dominate European landscapes today. Across the medieval Islamic world, the continued patronage of scholars by caliphs and sultans ensured that experimental observation and mathematical reasoning thrived, preserving a rational approach to knowledge that would later influence Europe's scientific awakening. Small legal decisions, such as recognizing contracts between strangers or allowing women limited property rights in certain regions, subtly reshaped economic participation and family structures over generations. None of these actions felt revolutionary in their own time. They were slow, careful, often conservative responses to immediate needs. Yet history remembers them, not for their intention, but for their outcome, revealing how the medieval world, often imagined as stagnant or dark, was quietly dynamic, constantly reshaping itself through countless modest decisions that together nudged humanity toward the modern age. As the medieval world drifted from century to century, still more subtle choices accumulated beneath the surface of everyday life, each one nudging history in a direction no single person could clearly see. When church authorities gradually standardized religious rituals and calendars across vast regions, they were aiming for unity and order. Yet this quiet synchronization shaped how entire societies understood time, seasons, and collective identity, allowing distant communities to feel part of the same moral and cultural rhythm. The later adoption of the Fey Gregorian calendar reform, Fey, rooted in medieval astronomical traditions, would refine this sense of time even further, affecting agriculture, trade, and global coordination in ways still felt today. In Northern Europe, merchants chose cooperation over constant rivalry, and formed networks like the Fey Hanseatic League Fey, not to change economics forever, but to protect ships and stabilize trade. In doing so, they normalized shared commercial rules, trust-based partnerships, and cross-border economic thinking that later defined international trade. Quiet legal habits also took shape as courts increasingly relied on written testimony instead of memory alone, shifting truth from personal reputation toward documented evidence, a transformation that deeply influenced modern justice systems. In households and villages, decisions about inheritance slowly evolved, with some regions allowing land to be divided rather than passed entirely to a single heir, a practical response to population growth that reshaped family structures and weakened ancient bloodline dominance. Medieval thinkers, often working within religious frameworks, chose to ask careful questions about nature, motion, and medicine, not to challenge faith, but to better understand creation. This balance between belief and inquiry kept rational thought alive during centuries, often misunderstood as intellectually frozen. Even language was shaped by quiet medieval choices. And still, the medieval legacy continues to deepen the more patiently one looks, because that era quietly trained humanity to live with life as an ongoing responsibility rather than a solved problem. Medieval people rarely believed they were building something new. They believed they were carrying something fragile. This sense of custodianship shaped how people treated land, institutions, traditions, and even relationships. Nothing felt disposable because replacement was uncertain. When something broke, it was repaired not out of nostalgia but necessity. This attitude slowly embedded the idea that preservation itself was a form of wisdom. Modern civilization, despite its obsession with innovation, still relies on this inherited instinct whenever it chooses maintenance over replacement, reform over collapse. Medieval life also reshaped how humans understood effort. Effort was not tied to immediate reward, visibility, or success. Work continued regardless of outcome. This separated action from validation and trained societies to function without constant reinforcement. People acted because roles existed, not because recognition followed. This discipline allowed large systems to operate without relying on motivation alone. Even today, institutions survive because people perform duties whose benefits are distant, abstract, or invisible. A direct inheritance from medieval endurance. Uncertainty was not treated as an enemy but as a condition of existence. Weather, health, politics, and fortune shifted without warning. And medieval societies learned not to anchor identity to stability. This flexibility prevented psychological collapse when circumstances changed. People expected disruption and planned loosely rather than rigidly. This expectation shaped cultures capable of absorbing shock. Modern resilient strategies echo this ancient understanding. Systems that assume stability fail quickly, while those designed for fluctuation endure. The medieval sense of belonging also trained humanity in coexistence. People lived within overlapping communities. Family, village, guild, faith, none of which fully define them alone. This distributed identity reduced the risk of total collapse when one structure failed. If authority disappointed, community remained. If belief wavered, custom endured. This redundancy created social resilience. Modern societies still depend on layered identity to absorb strain, even as they often underestimate its importance. Time itself was treated as expansive rather than scarce. Without constant urgency, people lived inside duration. Decisions unfolded slowly. Consequences revealed themselves gradually, and patience became a survival skill rather than a moral ideal. This relationship with time discouraged extremes. People learned that rushing often worsened outcomes. Modern systems, legal appeals, scientific review, democratic deliberation still rely on this medieval tolerance for delay, even as modern culture resists it. Medieval societies also normalized the coexistence of strength and fragility. Strength was not expected to be permanent, and fragility was not equated with failure. This balance prevented overconfidence during prosperity and despair during hardship. People understood that stability was temporary but renewable. This cyclical understanding allowed societies to recover repeatedly rather than collapse under disappointment. Modern cycles of boom and recovery follow the same pattern, often without acknowledging its ancient roots. Even morality was shaped by this realism. Goodness was not measured by purity, but by persistence. People were flawed, systems imperfect, outcomes uneven. Yet effort mattered. Repentance, correction, and continuation were valued more than perfection. This ethic shaped institutions capable of reform rather than replacement. Modern ideas of rehabilitation, accountability, and improvement reflect this medieval understanding that failure does not disqualify participation. Silence and waiting were also teachers. Without constant stimulation, people learn to endure boredom, reflection, and anticipation. This internal pacing prevented emotional overload. Modern life struggles with this inherited silence, yet still depends on it whenever focus, patience, or long-term thinking is required. The medieval world trained humanity to sit with discomfort without demanding immediate escape. Perhaps most profoundly, medieval people accepted that meaning was cumulative rather than immediate. Lives were not expected to feel complete. Contribution mattered more than fulfillment. People acted knowing they were adding a small piece to something larger. This humility toward purpose allowed societies to sustain long-term projects without requiring personal payoff. Universities, legal traditions, cultural memory, and infrastructure all depend on this willingness to contribute without closure. Conflict, too, was shaped by endurance. Medieval disputes often ended not with resolution but with exhaustion. This taught societies how to stop rather than win. Compromise became a survival skill. Living with unresolved tension proved preferable to endless destruction. Modern diplomacy, ceasefires, and negotiated peace inherit this ancient understanding that survival often requires acceptance rather than victory. Even imagination followed this pattern. Stories emphasized return, consequence, and continuity rather than instant triumph. Heroes endured more than they conquered. This narrative structure trained people to expect complexity rather than resolution. Modern storytelling still follows these rhythms because they reflect lived reality shaped over centuries. The medieval world did not believe in inevitability. It believed in effort. Progress was not guaranteed, but neither was collapse. Everything depended on participation. This belief quietly empowered ordinary people to sustain civilization without needing to understand it fully. Showing up mattered more than certainty. Maintenance mattered more than mastery. Over time, these habits became invisible. They embedded themselves into how humans organize, govern, cooperate, and endure. Modern life often mistakes these foundations for natural order, forgetting they were learned through centuries of uncertainty, repetition, and restraint. The medieval world did not announce its lessons. It practiced them until they became instinct. History tends to celebrate moments of change, but civilizations survive through moments of continuation. The medieval age mastered continuation. It taught humanity how to live without answers, how to function without guarantees, and how to endure without illusion. That lesson remains active every time a society chooses repair over rupture, patience over panic, and continuity over collapse. In the end, the medieval world changed everything, not by moving history forward dramatically, but by preventing it from falling apart through countless ordinary decisions, quiet, repetitive, uncelebrated. It trained humanity in the deepest skill of all, how to keep going when the future is unclear. Control is limited, and meaning must be carried rather than found. That skill still holds the world together today. And even after all of this accumulation, the medieval influence still refuses to end, because its deepest transformation was not structural alone, but psychological. Medieval life reshaped how human beings related to uncertainty at the most intimate level. People learned to wake each day without expecting clarity, comfort, or fairness, and yet still participate fully in life. This quiet courage, continuing without assurance, became a cultural reflex. Over centuries, it trained humanity to live without guarantees and still build systems that outlasted individual lives. Modern civilization often assumes confidence is required for action. But medieval life proved the opposite. Action can exist without confidence, and endurance often matters more than belief. Medieval people also learned how to live with delay as a normal condition. Answers came slowly, justice unfolded unevenly, and consequences revealed themselves over years rather than moments. This delay shaped patience not as a virtue to admire, but as a skill necessary for survival. People learned that rushing rarely improved outcomes and often made them worse. This understanding quietly shaped long-form institutions, law, education, religion, governance that still rely on extended timelines, appeals, reviews, traditions, and precedents. All depend on this inherited tolerance for slowness. Without it, modern systems would collapse under their own urgency. The medieval world also taught humanity how to distribute responsibility across time. Decisions were made with the awareness that their full effects would be felt by others. This awareness encouraged restraint. People did not assume they had the right to exhaust resources, traditions, or stability for immediate gain. Even when exploitation occurred, it was often moderated by fear of consequence, memory of past failure, or concern for lineage. This long shadow of responsibility shaped early environmental awareness, inheritance practices, and communal decision-making. Modern sustainability debates echo this ancient intuition that survival depends on what is preserved, not just what is extracted. In social life, medieval people became skilled at navigating ambiguity in relationships. Loyalties overlapped, obligations conflicted, and moral clarity was rarely absolute. Instead of demanding consistency, people learned to operate within contradiction. One could obey authority while resenting it, believe while doubting, belong while disagreeing. This tolerance for internal conflict allowed communities to remain intact despite difference. Modern pluralistic societies depend on this same ability to live with unresolved disagreement, an ability first refined when survival required coexistence. And even still, the medieval influence keeps unfolding the longer one looks, because what that age truly cultivated was a shared understanding that life was something to be carried, not solved. Medieval people did not expect clarity, fairness, or closure. They expected continuity. This expectation shaped a quiet discipline of endurance that became cultural muscle over time. People learned to function without answers, to act without assurance, and to commit without guarantees. This way of living trained societies to survive ambiguity without paralysis. Decisions were made not because they were perfect, but because delay carried its own risks. Over centuries, this habit embedded decisiveness, tempered by humility, a balance modern systems still struggle to maintain. The medieval world also refined humanity's relationship with failure. Failure was common, visible, and rarely final. Crops failed, rulers failed, plans failed, yet life continued. This repetition stripped failure of its power to destroy meaning. Instead of ending participation, failure became part of the process. People learned to absorb loss without withdrawing from collective life. This emotional resilience allowed institutions to persist even when individuals faltered. Modern concepts of iteration, reform, and recovery echo this older understanding that collapse was not inevitable simply because something went wrong. In everyday life, medieval people learned to share space with discomfort. Hunger, cold, uncertainty, and waiting were not exceptional. They were normal. This normalization reduced shock and cultivated emotional regulation. Societies learned to distinguish between discomfort and danger, between hardship and catastrophe. This distinction mattered deeply because it prevented constant crisis thinking. When everything is framed as emergency, nothing can be sustained. Medieval life, by contrast, taught that endurance required calibration, knowing when to act urgently and when to endure patiently. This instinct survives today in systems that prioritize stability over constant reaction. The medieval habit of layered responsibility also shaped long-term thinking. Individuals belonged simultaneously to family, community, faith, and authority. Loyalty was not singular, it was distributed. This distribution prevented total collapse when one layer failed. If a ruler was unjust, family remained. If harvest failed, community support mattered. If faith wavered, custom endured. This redundancy created resilience. Modern societies still rely on overlapping systems, legal, social, cultural, to absorb shock, an inheritance from a time when survival demanded backup upon backup. Even conflict was shaped by this logic. Disputes rarely ended decisively. They faded, transformed, or were suspended. This taught societies how to live with unresolved tension without constant violence. Peace was often imperfect, temporary, and negotiated, yet preferable to destruction. This acceptance of imperfect peace later evolved into diplomacy, treaties, and coexistence. The medieval world understood that total victory was rare and often destabilizing. Survival depended on learning how to stop fighting without solving everything. Time itself was experienced differently. Without constant measurement, medieval people lived inside duration rather than deadlines. This stretched perception of time reduced urgency and allowed consequences to unfold slowly. Decisions were evaluated across seasons and years, not moments. This patience shaped systems that could mature gradually. Even today, institutions like law, education, and governance depend on delayed outcomes and long evaluation cycles, an inheritance from centuries when immediacy was impossible. The medieval relationship with knowledge also shaped endurance. Knowledge was incomplete, fragmented, and often contradictory. Rather than demanding coherence, people learned to work with what they had. This pragmatism preserved learning through instability. Ideas were transmitted imperfectly, yet persistently. Over time, accumulation mattered more than accuracy. This acceptance allowed knowledge to survive long enough to be refined. Modern science, with its revisions and corrections, rests on this older tolerance for partial understanding. In social behavior, medieval people learned the power of habit. Repeated actions shaped expectation more than intention. Customs mattered because they were reliable. This reliance on habit stabilized societies where enforcement was limited. People knew what to expect because things were done the same way again and again. This predictability reduced fear and enabled cooperation. Modern routines, norms, and procedures still serve this function, quietly coordinating behavior without constant instruction. The medieval world also taught humanity how to live with inherited systems that could not be redesigned from scratch. People entered lives already structured by land, law, belief, and obligation. Choice existed, but within boundaries. This trained societies to negotiate constraint creatively rather than demand total freedom. Innovation occurred through adaptation, not replacement. This approach allowed continuity alongside change. Modern reforms often succeed when they follow this pattern and fail when they ignore it. Emotionally, medieval life cultivated endurance without numbness. Grief was acknowledged, joy celebrated, fear respected, but none were allowed to dominate permanently. Ritual provided containment. This emotional architecture prevented extremes from destabilizing community life. Modern mental health practices often rediscover these principles under new language. Yet the underlying skill, living with emotion without being consumed by it, was practiced for centuries without formal theory. Even imagination was shaped by endurance. Stories emphasized cycles, return, consequence, and moral weight. Triumph was often temporary, meaning unfolded slowly. This narrative structure trained people to expect complexity rather than resolution. Modern storytelling still relies on these patterns because they resonate with how life actually unfolds. Perhaps the most profound medieval lesson was this: civilization survives not because people understand it, but because they participate in it. Participation mattered more than belief. Showing up mattered more than certainty. Maintaining systems mattered more than perfecting them. This insight allowed societies to function even when trust was fragile, leadership flawed, and knowledge incomplete. Over centuries, these quiet decisions accumulated. No single choice changed the world. No moment announced transformation. Instead, the medieval world rehearsed the future patiently, teaching humanity how to live with limits, delay, imperfection, and uncertainty without giving up on continuity. When later centuries accelerated change, they relied unknowingly on this training. The medieval age did not gift the modern world with answers. It gifted it with stamina. And stamina, more than vision or innovation, is what allows civilizations to survive long enough for change to matter. And even after all of this, the medieval influence still stretches forward, because its deepest gift was teaching humanity how to exist inside unfinished stories. Medieval people lived knowing their lives were fragments of something larger, something begun before them and destined to continue after them. This awareness shaped humility toward time. Actions were not expected to resolve history. They were expected to fit into it. This sense of partial participation reduced the burden of perfection and allowed societies to keep functioning even when ideals failed. People learned that being a link in a chain was enough. That insight quietly shaped how institutions, traditions, and responsibilities were passed forward without collapsing under the weight of expectation. Medieval life also normalized repetition as meaningful rather than empty days. Often looked alike, years followed familiar patterns, and rituals returned predictably. Instead of seeking novelty, people found security in recurrence. This taught societies that meaning did not require constant change, only continuity. Over time, this produced cultures that could survive monotony without restlessness. Modern systems, bureaucracies, education, governance still rely on this tolerance for repetition, even as individuals often resist it. The medieval world showed that repetition is not stagnation. It is structure, scarcity-shaped wisdom. Because resources were limited and fragile, medieval people learned restraint as a practical necessity. Excess threatened survival. This cultivated moderation in consumption, ambition, and expectation. People learned to operate within boundaries rather than constantly pushing against them. This discipline allowed communities to endure environmental and social stress without exhausting themselves. Even today, sustainability depends on relearning this medieval lesson that survival favors balance over excess. The medieval relationship with authority further refined endurance. Power was visible, personal, and often flawed. Because authority was not abstract, people learned to negotiate with it directly, through loyalty, resistance, appeal, or patience. This taught societies how to live under imperfect rule without dissolving into chaos. Obedience was rarely absolute, and rebellion was rarely total. Most life unfolded in the space between. This grey zone became a training ground for political realism. Modern democratic negotiation echoes this ancient skill of living with power rather than imagining its elimination. Even the medieval sense of justice was shaped by endurance. Justice was slow, incomplete, and inconsistent. Yet the pursuit continued. This persistence taught societies that justice was a direction rather than a destination. People learned to value process even when outcomes disappointed. And still, the medieval legacy continues to unfold, because its quietest lesson was how to live inside limits without surrendering purpose. Medieval people rarely believed they were moving towards something better. They believed they were holding something together. This distinction shaped a mindset where preservation itself was meaningful. Keeping peace, keeping land productive, keeping customs intact, keeping faith alive. These were seen as successes, even if nothing visibly improved. Over time, this trained societies to recognize value in stability, an idea that later allowed large, complex systems to survive periods of stagnation without collapse. The medieval willingness to accept slow outcomes reduced panic during uncertainty, allowing institutions to absorb shocks gradually. People learned that not every crisis demanded reinvention, and that endurance could be more powerful than reaction. In relationships, the expectation of long memory encouraged caution and forgiveness, because people knew they would continue living alongside one another. This reduced extremes of behavior and normalized repair after conflict. Even imagination was shaped by this worldview, favoring stories where meaning emerged over time rather than through instant resolution. Medieval life taught humanity that time itself could heal, correct, and reveal if allowed to pass without being forced. This trust in time became a stabilizing force beneath law, culture, and belief. Across centuries, people learned to live with unanswered questions, unresolved tensions, and incomplete systems, and still move forward. That ability to function without closure became essential as societies grew more complex. The medieval world did not hand down perfect solutions. It handed down tolerance for imperfection, and that tolerance made progress possible without destruction. Long after the medieval age ended, the habits it formed, patience, restraint, continuity, cooperation, remained quietly embedded in human systems. They still guide how societies weather uncertainty, absorb change, and survive periods when clarity is absent. In this way, the medieval world did not simply precede the modern one. It taught humanity how to carry the future carefully, even when it could not yet be seen. And still, the medieval inheritance stretches on, deepening not through singular acts, but through the steady repetition of choices that favoured survival over certainty. Medieval people learned to live knowing that most effort would be unseen, uncelebrated, and often unrewarded in their own lifetimes. This acceptance reshaped how societies understood duty. Work was done because it needed to be done, not because it promised progress. Fields were tended, despite uncertain harvests. Laws were followed, despite imperfect justice, and customs were preserved, despite changing realities. Over generations, this cultivated a deep respect for continuity itself, teaching humanity that holding things together was a meaningful achievement. In a world where collapse was always possible, maintaining order became an act of quiet courage. This mindset shaped institutions that valued endurance over brilliance, reliability over innovation, and stability over speed. Medieval societies learned to absorb disappointment without abandoning structure, to accept setbacks without losing identity, and to rebuild without demanding transformation. Time in the medieval world was not an enemy to be conquered, but a force to be endured. People measured life in seasons, reigns, and generations, not milestones or breakthroughs. This long view softened impatience and restrained ambition, allowing decisions to be evaluated slowly rather than instantly. Mistakes were not always fatal. They were absorbed, corrected, or lived with. Over centuries, this relationship with time trained humanity to function inside slow systems, where cause and effect were separated by years rather than moments. Modern governance, economics, and law still depend on this tolerance for delay, even as technology tempts speed. The medieval world taught that systems which cannot survive waiting are too fragile to last. In social life, repeated interaction within limited communities created an expectation of accountability that required no surveillance. People behaved with the knowledge that reputation lingered, memory persisted, and consequences unfolded gradually. This social memory acted as an invisible regulator, shaping behavior long before formal enforcement was widespread. Trust became cumulative rather than transactional, built slowly through consistency rather than promises. This habit carried forward into institutions that still rely on credibility, precedent, and history more than force alone. Medieval people did not need to articulate these principles. They lived them, day after day, until they became instinct. Even inequality, deeply entrenched and often unjust, produced unintended lessons. Because hierarchy was stable and visible, it could be navigated, negotiated, and eventually questioned. People learned where power lay, how to appeal to it, how to resist it quietly, and how to survive beneath it. This familiarity with structured power later allowed societies to reform authority without destroying it entirely. Revolt was not the only response. Adaptation, compromise, and endurance were equally real strategies. The medieval world thus trained humanity not only in obedience, but in survival within imperfect systems, a skill that remains essential wherever power is unevenly distributed. In belief and morality, medieval life emphasized consequence over abstraction. Actions were understood to echo beyond the present moment, shaping reputation, family standing, and spiritual fate. This belief fostered restraint even when enforcement was weak. People acted not because they were watched, but because actions were believed to matter over time. This internalization of responsibility became one of the strongest foundations of social order. Long before modern concepts of ethics or psychology, medieval societies practiced a lived morality rooted in habit, memory, and expectation. Communication itself shaped endurance. Letters took weeks or months to arrive, disputes unfolded over years, and decisions were rarely instantaneous. This slowness discouraged impulsive reaction and encouraged reflection. People learned to sit with uncertainty, to wait for answers, and to accept that not everything could be resolved immediately. Over time, this produced emotional discipline at a collective level. Anxiety existed, fear was real, but panic was tempered by familiarity with delay. The medieval world trained humanity to survive without constant feedback, a skill increasingly rare yet deeply embedded in modern institutional life. Maintenance became a defining virtue. Roads were patched, buildings repaired, laws amended, customs adjusted. Rarely was anything finished. Everything was ongoing. This normalized the idea that civilization itself was a process rather than a product. Medieval people did not expect perfection, they expected continuation. This expectation shaped political realism, economic caution, and social patience. Even when systems failed, they were rebuilt on the same foundations rather than replaced entirely. This preference for repair over reinvention allowed societies to accumulate depth instead of repeatedly starting over. Loss was constant, and because it was constant, it was structured. Rituals for death, mourning, inheritance, and remembrance allowed grief to exist without dissolving community. People learned how to carry sorrow alongside obligation, how to mourn and continue at the same time. This emotional architecture made societies resilient to repeated trauma. Instead of breaking under weight, they bent, absorbed, and persisted. Modern societies still rely on these inherited structures when facing crisis, often without realizing how old the habits truly are. The medieval world also normalized living with contradiction. Faith coexisted with doubt, obedience with resistance, tradition with gradual change. Rather than demanding coherence, people learned to navigate tension. This tolerance for inconsistency allowed cultures to evolve without tearing themselves apart. Systems could be imperfect, beliefs could be questioned quietly, and life could continue anyway. This acceptance of ambiguity is one of the hidden foundations of modern pluralism and complexity. Above all, medieval life taught humanity how to persist without illusion. People did not expect steady improvement, guaranteed justice, or lasting peace. They expected fluctuation, reversal, and uncertainty. And because expectations were restrained, disappointment did not destroy structure. Hope was quieter, grounded not in transformation, but in survival. Another year endured was success. Another generation raised was victory. This humility shaped societies capable of lasting longer than any single vision or ideology. By the time later, ages spoke of progress, reform, and revolution. The capacity to sustain change already existed. That capacity was not built by bold declarations, but by centuries of ordinary people choosing to maintain what they inherited, adjust what failed, and pass it forward incomplete yet intact. The medieval world did not imagine the future clearly, but it carried it carefully through patience, restraint, repetition, and endurance. It built the deep foundations upon which modern life still stands. History remembers the loud moments, but civilization is carried by quiet ones. And the medieval age, more than any other, understood how to keep going when certainty was scarce, solutions partial, and time the only ally available. And even after all this, the medieval contribution continues to widen, because its most enduring lesson was not how to advance, but how to remain human under pressure. Medieval people lived close to limits of food, health, knowledge, and even at this far edge, the medieval influence still did not fade, because its deepest power lay in teaching humanity how to coexist with unfinishedness. Medieval people lived knowing that most things would remain incomplete. Projects half-built, laws imperfectly enforced, knowledge fragmentary, and yet life went on. This quiet acceptance shaped a civilizational habit of functioning amid gaps, delays, and contradictions without demanding closure. In doing so, societies learned that stability did not require completeness, only continuity. The medieval experience normalized the idea that systems could work well enough without being fully understood. A lesson that later allowed complex institutions to operate despite their inner opacity. People trusted processes they could not see entirely, because experience taught them that gradual reliability mattered more than total comprehension. In social life, the expectation of repeated interaction fostered restraint, as reputations accumulated slowly and could be lost quickly. This created informal regulation long before formal enforcement was possible. Over generations, individuals learned that behavior today shaped trust tomorrow, embedding long-term consequence into everyday choice. Even imagination was disciplined by this world, favoring stories of endurance, return, and moral reckoning over instant triumph. Medieval people understood that time itself was an actor, revealing meaning slowly, correcting excess, and rewarding persistence more than brilliance. By living within that understanding, they developed patience not as a virtue to admire, but as a necessity to survive. When later centuries introduced speed, expansion, and abstraction, they rested unknowingly on this medieval training in tolerance, restraint, and continuity. The future did not replace the medieval world. It inherited its habits. Beneath modern law, economy, governance, and culture lies a quiet expectation learned long ago, that life will be uncertain, progress uneven, and systems imperfect, yet still worth maintaining. This expectation, forged in medieval lives, lived without guarantees, remains one of history's most enduring gifts. And even after all this accumulation, the medieval world continued to leave its mark through an almost stubborn commitment to continuity in the face of uncertainty. People acted with the understanding that clarity was rare and permanence uncertain, yet obligations still mattered. Promises were kept not because outcomes were guaranteed, but because keeping them was what allowed society to hold together at all. This quiet loyalty to process over outcome-shaped cultures, where reliability became a moral value, not just a practical one. Medieval people learned to trust systems they had inherited, even while slowly adjusting them, because abandoning structure entirely was more dangerous than enduring its flaws. In this way, conservatism was not resistance to change, but a method of survival. The slow rhythm of life encouraged reflection between action and consequence, giving societies time to absorb lessons without panic. Even suffering had structure: rituals for grief, customs for loss, seasons for recovery. which prevented despair from dissolving community bonds. Over generations, these practices taught humanity how to live with pain without becoming consumed by it. The medieval sense of time, stretching backward through ancestors and forward through descendants, reinforced responsibility beyond the present moment, shaping decisions that favoured preservation over exploitation. People acted knowing they would not see the full results of their labour, and yet they laboured anyway. This acceptance of delayed meaning trained societies to build for futures they could not imagine when later ages demanded speed, certainty, and constant improvement. They relied unknowingly on this inherited patience. The medieval world did not teach humanity how to conquer time. It taught how to live inside it. Through countless ordinary decisions, choosing to maintain, to wait, to endure, to cooperate, it shaped a quiet strength beneath history's surface. That strength remains, largely unnoticed, supporting modern life like deep roots beneath a towering structure, invisible yet essential, holding everything upright long after the medieval age itself has faded from memory. And even here, the medieval contribution still unfolds, because its deepest legacy was psychological rather than mechanical. Medieval people learned to live without the expectation that the world would make sense quickly, clearly, or completely. This acceptance shaped emotional endurance, teaching societies how to function without constant reassurance or explanation. People acted because action was required, not because certainty was available. Over time, this produced cultures where responsibility preceded understanding, where duty was performed even when outcomes were unclear. That habit quietly shaped modern professionalism, civic obligation, and institutional trust. In everyday life, medieval communities learned that stability emerged from repetition rather than inspiration, from showing up again and again rather than waiting for perfect conditions. This rhythm trained societies to survive fatigue, boredom, and disappointment without unraveling. The slow accumulation of shared memory of what had failed before, what had barely worked, what had endured, became a guide stronger than theory. Even authority was tempered by this memory, as rulers understood, often reluctantly, that power without continuity invited collapse. Across generations, people learned that time itself was a stabilizing force, smoothing extremes and revealing consequences gradually. By trusting time rather than demanding immediate resolution, medieval societies allowed systems to mature organically. This patience made complexity survivable. The modern world often credits its resilience to innovation, but beneath that resilience lies. And still, the medieval imprint extends even further, because what that era ultimately cultivated was a shared tolerance for slow outcomes and unseen rewards. People learned to act without applause, to contribute to systems whose benefits might never return directly to them. And this quietly shaped the idea of collective responsibility. Fields were improved, knowing others might harvest them. Laws were refined, knowing future generations would live under them. And customs were preserved, knowing their purpose might only become clear with time. This long patience trained societies to value contribution over recognition. In daily life, medieval people accepted that effort did not guarantee success. Yet effort remained necessary, reinforcing discipline without optimism. This created cultures capable of functioning without constant hope, relying instead on habit and duty. Even uncertainty became familiar rather than frightening, as repeated exposure to instability taught people that life could remain meaningful without predictability. Over centuries, this normalized resilience at a communal level, making collapse less likely even when individuals failed. The medieval world quietly demonstrated that continuity does not require perfection, vision, or certainty, only participation. By showing up, maintaining what existed, and passing it forward slightly improved, or at least intact, people sustained civilizations larger than themselves. This mindset flowed forward into modern institutions that still rely on individuals fulfilling roles without seeing the whole. Long after medieval languages faded and borders shifted, this behavioral inheritance remained. The world learned how to keep systems alive even when belief wavered, leadership faltered, or knowledge lagged behind reality. That ability to continue without clarity, to maintain without guarantee, is one of the medieval era's most profound legacies. It reminds us that history is not carried forward by those who see the future clearly, but by those willing to support it quietly, patiently, and repeatedly, even when the destination remains unknown. And even beyond this, the medieval influence persisted through a quiet reshaping of how people related to effort itself. Work was understood not as a path to rapid improvement, but as a condition of existence, something done because life required it, not because reward was guaranteed. This understanding trained societies to function without constant motivation, relying instead on routine, obligation, and shared expectation. Over time, this produced communities capable of sustaining long projects, walls, canals, churches, records, traditions, across lifetimes. Medieval people learned that meaning could exist in maintenance, in keeping things from falling apart, rather than pushing them forward dramatically. This outlook softened disappointment and reduced the shock of failure, because progress was never assumed to be linear. In social life, people grew accustomed to compromise as a permanent state rather than a temporary setback, allowing disagreement to coexist with cooperation. The slow rhythm of cause and effect encouraged humility, as individuals rarely saw the full impact of their actions, teaching restraint in judgment and ambition. Even hope took a quieter form, grounded not in expectation of change, but in the belief that continuity itself was valuable. Across generations, this created cultures where survival was not a sign of stagnation, but of success. Medieval societies did not seek to escape uncertainty, they learned to inhabit it. By doing so, they built emotional and structural endurance into everyday life. Long after the medieval world passed, this endurance remained embedded in how societies handled delay, ambiguity, and imperfect systems. Modern civilization often credits its strength to innovation and speed. Yet it continues to depend on an older inheritance, the capacity to persist without clarity, to cooperate without consensus. Even at its most ordinary, medieval life kept nudging history forward through decisions so small they felt instinctive rather than deliberate. When communities accepted slow consensus instead of instant agreement, they normalized patience as a social virtue, allowing disagreement to exist without tearing societies apart. The medieval comfort with gradual adaptation, adjusting customs slightly rather than replacing them entirely, made systems durable, capable of absorbing pressure without shattering. In households, the routine passing down of stories, skills, and warnings from elders to youth preserved hard-earned knowledge in a world without manuals, quietly shaping cultures that valued memory and experience. The acceptance of seasonal uncertainty. where bad harvests or harsh winters were expected, rather than shocking trained people to plan with humility, embedding resilience into everyday thinking. Even the way medieval people approached authority mattered. Obedience was often balanced with expectation, creating an unspoken contract where rulers were tolerated only as long as they maintained order and protection. In towns and villages, shared responsibility for roads, defences and festivals reinforced the idea that public life required participation, not just rule from above. The slow recognition that written promises carried weight beyond spoken ones stabilized long-distance relationships, allowing trust to stretch across time and space. In belief and morality, the medieval focus on intention, repentance, and improvement encouraged the idea that people could change, a subtle but powerful foundation for later ideas of reform and personal growth. Across generations, these choices shaped a worldview where continuity mattered more than speed, and survival depended on cooperation rather than constant dominance. None of this felt like progress in the modern sense. It felt like endurance. Yet it was precisely this endurance, quiet, patient, and collective, that allowed societies to grow complex without collapsing. By living within uncertainty and choosing stability again and again, medieval people prepared humanity for a future built not on sudden certainty, but on systems strong enough to hold doubt, difference, and change. And even then, the medieval influence did not exhaust itself, because the quiet power of that era lay in repetition rather than novelty. Day after day, people learned to live within limits, limited knowledge, limited resources, limited certainty, and those limits shaped habits that still govern modern life. The medieval acceptance that not everything could be known or controlled fostered caution in decision, encouraging societies to test changes slowly rather than gamble everything at once. In this environment, moderation became a survival skill, whether in spending, punishment, belief, or ambition. The routine expectation that life would involve hardship made endurance more valued than comfort, quietly training generations to persist rather than collapse when conditions worsened. In governance, the slow layering of authority, custom beneath law beneath religion, religion beneath conscience, created checks that prevented any single force from dominating completely for long. The medieval tendency to record agreements, debts, and obligations, even when enforcement was weak, reinforced the belief that order was worth maintaining even under strain. In social life, hospitality toward travellers and strangers, though often cautious, preserved channels of communication and exchange, preventing isolation and stagnation. The willingness to preserve ruins, relics, and traditions tied people to a sense of continuity, reminding them that they were part of something older and longer, lasting than any single lifetime. Even boredom played a role, as long stretches of routine encouraged reflection, imagination, and storytelling, keeping inner life active in a world with few distractions. Over centuries, these patterns trained humanity to operate within slow systems, legal, cultural, moral, that could survive crisis without constant reinvention. By the time later, ages demanded speed, innovation, and disruption, the underlying structures capable of supporting such change had already been quietly rehearsed. The medieval world did not rush toward the future. It absorbed it gradually, through countless ordinary decisions made by people who never expected their lives to matter beyond their own villages or years. And yet, in choosing patience over panic, continuity over collapse, and cooperation over chaos, they shaped a world resilient enough to carry everything that came after. Even after centuries of repetition, medieval life continued to shape the future through choices that felt almost invisible because they were embedded in survival itself. People learned to live with incomplete information and still act, creating a culture where decisions were made cautiously, revised slowly, and judged over time rather than instantly. This patience shaped legal customs, moral reasoning, and social expectations, making stability preferable to dramatic change. In communities where memory mattered more than speed, reputation became a form of currency, teaching societies that trust, once broken, was difficult to restore. The medieval habit of enduring discomfort without immediate solutions fostered resilience, allowing populations to survive famine, disease, and political instability without abandoning their social structures. In daily work, the repetition of manual labor reinforced respect for process, effort, and gradual mastery, embedding the idea that skill and improvement came through time rather than shortcuts. Even the acceptance of inequality, while deeply flawed, created predictable frameworks that could later be questioned and reformed instead of violently overturned. The slow blending of sacred and practical life, where faith coexisted with trade, law, and family, prevented rigid separation of values from action, shaping societies that judged behavior as much as belief. Across generations, people learned to expect uncertainty and still plan, to rely on community rather than individual strength, and to measure success not by speed but by survival. These habits quietly trained humanity to live within systems larger than any one person, preparing the ground for complex institutions, long-term governance, and collective responsibility. The medieval world did not imagine progress as a straight line. It understood life as cycles, setbacks, and recoveries. A mindset that allowed societies to endure without constant collapse. By choosing continuity again and again, repairing instead of replacing, adapting instead of abandoning, medieval people created a deep structural calm beneath history's surface. That calm is what allowed later revolutions, discoveries, and transformations to occur without destroying everything that came before. In the end, the medieval legacy is not a single invention or law, but a way of living with time itself, slowly, cautiously, cooperatively, and persistently, until the future arrived almost unnoticed, built upon decisions no one thought would ever matter beyond their own uncertain lives. And even beyond this quiet endurance, medieval life continued to shape the future through a deep acceptance of gradual consequence, where actions were understood to echo forward, even if their outcomes could not be fully seen. People learned that decisions made today, how land was divided, how debts were recorded, how disputes were settled, would affect children and grandchildren, embedding a long moral shadow over everyday choices. This awareness encouraged restraint, compromise, and continuity in a world where reversal was often impossible. The medieval comfort with layered authority, where church, custom, and local power overlapped, trained societies to navigate complexity without demanding perfect clarity, a skill essential for modern bureaucratic life. In communication, the slow exchange of letters taught patience and reflection, encouraging thoughtfulness over impulsive reaction. The repeated experience of rebuilding trust after conflict between neighbors, families, or regions normalized reconciliation as a social necessity rather than a moral weakness. Even the acceptance of silence, waiting, and uncertainty shaped emotional discipline, teaching people to live without constant reassurance. Over centuries, this cultivated an inner steadiness that allowed societies to absorb shock without unraveling. Medieval people did not expect life to be fair, fast, or predictable, and in that expectation, they developed systems strong enough to function anyway. Their choices favored durability over efficiency, familiarity over novelty, and shared survival over individual triumph. These preferences quietly shaped institutions that could bend without breaking, adapt without forgetting, and grow without losing coherence. By the time later eras demanded speed, certainty, and innovation, humanity already possessed the habits needed to sustain them. The medieval world did not announce its influence with bold declarations or sudden transformations. It whispered it into the structure of everyday life, and through those whispers, repeated across centuries, it shaped a world capable of remembering its past, enduring its present, and carrying its future forward long after the candlelight of the medieval age had faded. And even at this depth, the medieval influence did not truly end, because its greatest contribution was not a single system or belief, but a way of living with time, uncertainty, and limitation. Medieval people became accustomed to waiting for harvests, for justice, for travel, for answers, and this waiting trained societies to tolerate delay without abandoning structure. From this patience emerged institutions designed to last rather than impress, to endure rather than dominate, and still, the quiet momentum of medieval life carried on, shaping the future through habits so deeply woven into daily existence that they felt timeless even as they were new. When communities accepted the idea that laws should outlive rulers, they subtly detached justice from personality, allowing societies to survive bad kings, weak lords, or unstable successions without collapsing entirely. The medieval willingness to rebuild after destruction, towns after fires, fields after famine, churches after war, instilled a cultural expectation of recovery rather than abandonment, teaching generations that continuity mattered more than perfection. In trade, the growing trust in weights, measures, and standardized pricing reduced conflict and suspicion, allowing markets to function smoothly among strangers and preparing the ground for large-scale economies. The simple habit of keeping household accounts, whether by nobles or merchants, trained people to think in terms of income, expense, saving, and debt, quietly reshaping attitudes toward wealth and responsibility. In religion, the practice of confession encouraged introspection and moral self-examination, nurturing an inner sense of accountability that extended beyond public enforcement and into personal conscience. The medieval emphasis on lineage and ancestry recorded in family trees and oral memory reinforced long-term thinking, encouraging individuals to act with future generations in mind, rather than immediate gain alone. Even humor, festivals, and seasonal celebrations played a role, as they preserved communal bonds and shared identity during hard times, proving that social cohesion was as vital to survival as food or shelter. The slow integration of foreign words into local languages reflected constant cultural contact, expanding expression, and shaping how people thought and communicated. Across countryside and city alike, the acceptance of gradual change over sudden rupture created societies resilient to pressure, capable of adapting without losing their core. None of these decisions were made to design the modern world, yet together they formed a deep cultural training, teaching humanity how to live within systems, trust abstractions, cooperate across distance, and endure uncertainty. By the time later centuries arrived with revolutions, discoveries, and empires, the foundation had already been laid in silence through medieval choices repeated. So often they became invisible. The world did not wake up one day transformed. It drifted there, carried forward by generations who never knew they were shaping history, only that they were choosing, day by day, how best to live. Even beyond these patterns, medieval life kept shaping the future through decisions that felt less like choices and more like habits slowly settling into place. When communities accepted gradual compromise over absolute victory between lords and peasants, church and crown, town and countryside, they normalized negotiation as a survival skill, teaching societies to bend rather than break under pressure. The medieval tolerance for slow resolution, where disputes could last years and still be considered normal, trained people to think in long timelines, a mindset that later allowed complex institutions to evolve instead of collapsing at the first sign of strain. In everyday survival, the habit of storing grain, salting meat, and preparing for winter reinforced planning beyond immediate needs, embedding the idea that the future was something that could be prepared for rather than feared blindly. The acceptance of hierarchy, while often harsh, also created predictable roles and responsibilities, enabling large populations to function with relative stability until those structures were gradually questioned and reshaped. In spirituality, the medieval blending of fear and hope shaped ethical systems, where actions were believed to carry consequences beyond the visible world, encouraging restraint, charity, and communal obligation, even when enforcement was weak. The slow spread of written correspondence between distant courts, merchants, and scholars normalized long-distance communication, shrinking the psychological size of the world and making coordination across regions imaginable. Even the choice to rebuild ruins rather than abandon them tied people to place, reinforcing continuity and historical memory in landscapes layered with past generations. Across centuries of uncertainty, medieval societies learned to live with ambiguity, unpredictable harvests, shifting rulers, incomplete knowledge, without demanding immediate clarity, a tolerance that allowed ideas, systems, and technologies to mature gradually. None of these developments arrived with declarations or dramatic turning points. They seeped into daily life through repetition, necessity, and adaptation. By enduring, adjusting, and quietly choosing what worked, medieval people shaped the rhythms of governance, economy, belief, and identity that modern life still follows. The greatest legacy of medieval decisions is not found in monuments or famous names, but in the invisible structures of patience, cooperation, and long-term thinking that continue to guide how societies function today, reminding us that history is most often written not in moments of certainty, but in long stretches of quiet persistence. Beyond even these slow-moving patterns, medieval society continued to shape the modern world through choices so repetitive and familiar that they faded into the background of life itself. When people accepted that authority could be shared between king and council, lord and vassal, bishop and monarch, they quietly weakened the idea of absolute power, allowing balance and negotiation to become normal rather than exceptional. The medieval habit of appealing to precedent, asking, "How was this done before?" anchored change to continuity, ensuring that innovation rarely destroyed what already worked. In daily labor, The rhythm of collective work, harvests, construction, communal repairs, reinforced cooperation as a survival instinct, teaching societies that progress often required shared effort rather than individual ambition alone. The slow spread of literacy among merchants and craftsmen transformed reading from a sacred act into a practical skill, expanding who could access contracts, instructions, and ideas, and subtly shifting power away from exclusive elites. Even mistakes mattered, as failed harvest policies, collapsed banks, or unpopular laws forced rulers to adjust, embedding the principle that governance could learn from error rather than deny it. The medieval acceptance of gradual improvement, better tools instead of perfect ones, safer roads instead of ideal routes, trained societies to value progress over perfection. In faith and philosophy, the willingness to live with unanswered questions preserved curiosity without demanding immediate resolution, allowing knowledge to accumulate patiently. Generations grew accustomed to living inside layered systems, customs, laws, beliefs, economies that no single person controlled, preparing humanity to function within complex modern institutions. None of this felt heroic or historic at the time. It felt ordinary, repetitive, sometimes frustrating. Yet it was precisely this ordinariness that gave medieval decisions their power, because when habits repeat across centuries, they become destiny. Long before the modern world named its principles, law, citizenship, economy, science, rights, it was already practicing them quietly, shaped by medieval people who never knew they were building the future, only that they were choosing how to endure another season, another reign, another uncertain year. And still the medieval current flowed onward, shaping the future through choices that blended so seamlessly into daily life that they escaped notice entirely. When people learned to live under multiple identities at once, as villagers, subjects of a lord, members of a church, participants in a town or guild, they quietly practiced layered belonging, a mindset essential for later national, civic, and global identities. The medieval habit of resolving uncertainty through custom, rather than constant reinvention, stabilized societies where written law was limited, teaching generations that continuity itself was a form of wisdom. In markets and fairs, repeated face-to-face exchange built reputations that mattered more than force, reinforcing trust as an economic asset long before formal regulation existed. The slow acceptance of public shame, fines, or exile, instead of physical punishment in some regions, hinted at a shift toward social correction rather than pure retribution. In learning and craft, imitation was valued as much as originality, ensuring that skills survived intact across generations and preventing fragile knowledge from disappearing with individual deaths. The medieval tendency to blend old beliefs with new realities, absorbing innovations without fully abandoning tradition, created cultures capable of change without rupture. Even the way people imagined the future was shaped quietly, rather than expecting sudden transformation. Medieval societies planned for continuity, inheritance, and stewardship, embedding long-term responsibility into everyday thinking. The endurance of rituals, from seasonal farming cycles to religious observances, anchored people psychologically during uncertainty, proving that stability could be emotional as well as structural. Over centuries, these habits trained humanity to live inside slow systems, where progress emerged not from dramatic breaks, but from patient adjustment. By the time later ages spoke of reform, revolution, or enlightenment, the mental tools required to sustain those changes were already in place, forged by medieval lives spent choosing survival, cooperation, and continuity over chaos. The medieval world did not merely pass time until something better arrived. Still more quiet medieval choices continued to steer the future in subtle but powerful ways, often emerging from moments that seemed routine or purely local at the time. When rulers allowed Jewish, Armenian, and Muslim communities to settle in certain cities for their skills in trade, medicine, and administration. These were pragmatic economic decisions. Yet they created multicultural urban centers where knowledge crossed religious and cultural boundaries, enriching science, finance, and philosophy, while also shaping long-term tensions and coexistence. The choice by medieval navigators to refine maps using portolan charts based on accumulated sailor experience rather than classical theory slowly transformed navigation from guesswork into a skill grounded in observation, making later oceanic exploration possible without any single dramatic breakthrough. In agriculture, peasants deciding to enclose common lands for efficiency unintentionally began a process that altered rural life forever, reducing communal traditions and encouraging private ownership, a shift that would later support capitalist farming and mass urban migration. Within castles and courts, scribes quietly refined administrative language, standardizing measurements, currencies, and taxation terms, which reduced confusion and strengthened centralized authority, slowly replacing fragmented feudal rule with more cohesive states. Even health practices mattered. As medieval hospitals, often run by religious orders, chose to care for the sick regardless of status, embedding the idea that organized healthcare was a social responsibility rather than a private privilege. The gradual acceptance of notaries and witnesses in legal agreements turned trust into a formal system, reducing reliance on personal bonds and enabling complex societies of strangers to function. In warfare, the decision to pay soldiers wages instead of relying solely on feudal obligation professionalized armies, shifting loyalty from landowners to the state, and permanently changing how power was enforced. Artistic choices also carried long shadows, as medieval painters and architects experimented with perspective light and proportion to better reflect reality, quietly training the human eye to expect accuracy and realism, a habit that later fueled scientific illustration and empirical thinking. Across villages and towns, the habit of apprenticeships formalized skill transmission, ensuring knowledge survived beyond individual lifetimes and creating a workforce capable of sustained innovation. These decisions were not guided by visions of modernity, progress, or global consequence. They were shaped by survival, efficiency, faith, and habit. Yet history reveals that it was precisely this lack of grand intention that made them so powerful. Because when millions of ordinary medieval people made small, sensible choices day after day, century after century, they collectively redirected the course of civilization, proving that the world we inhabit today is less the result of dramatic turning points and more the quiet echo of countless medieval decisions, patiently accumulating until the future was quietly, irreversibly changed. Even deeper beneath the surface, medieval life was shaped by countless unnoticed choices that slowly hardened into traditions, systems, and expectations that the modern world still inherits. When communities accepted the authority of local councils and elders to settle disputes rather than resorting to private revenge, they were choosing peace over pride in small, practical ways. Yet this habit steadily reduced cycles of violence and strengthened the idea that justice should be institutional rather than personal. The medieval preference for oaths sworn on sacred objects may appear symbolic, but it reinforced accountability in societies with limited enforcement power, embedding the belief that words carried moral weight, a concept that later evolved into binding contracts and legal responsibility. In education, the decision to structure learning around lectures and disputations trained generations to argue logically, listen carefully, and refine ideas through debate, quietly shaping intellectual discipline long before modern classrooms existed. The slow normalization of surnames, initially adopted for taxation or record keeping, gave individuals fixed identities across generations, transforming how lineage, property, and responsibility were understood. In towns, the choice to ring bells to mark hours, warnings, or gatherings gradually synchronized communal life, creating shared awareness and coordination that made complex social organization possible. Even fashion carried long-term consequences, as standardized clothing styles signaled profession, status, or allegiance, reinforcing social order while also enabling later challenges to class distinctions when such symbols were questioned or abandoned. Maritime communities deciding to insure cargo against loss invented early risk management, spreading danger across groups, and encouraging bold trade ventures that would otherwise have seemed impossible. The acceptance of paper for records and communication, cheaper and more flexible than parchment, accelerated bureaucracy and information flow, quietly preparing societies for mass administration. Across Europe and beyond, rulers who tolerated limited dissent within religious or scholarly boundaries preserved intellectual diversity, ensuring that alternative ideas survived long enough to resurface more openly in later centuries. None of these decisions were recorded as great milestones, and few were celebrated in chronicles or songs, yet they accumulated like layers of sediment, each one thin but enduring. By the time the medieval world faded into what we now call the early modern age, the foundations of global trade, modern governance, scientific reasoning, and social mobility were already in place. Not because medieval people aimed to build the future, but because they repeatedly chose what worked, what endured, and what brought stability in the moment. In that quiet persistence lies the true power of medieval decisions, a reminder that history is most often changed not by dramatic intention, but by ordinary people choosing practicality, cooperation, and continuity day after day, until the world itself slowly becomes something new. Still more layers of medieval choice continue to accumulate, almost invisibly, shaping habits of thought and structures of life that later generations would mistake for inevitability. When medieval communities accepted written charters as proof of rights and privileges, they were not attempting to invent legal permanence, but they unintentionally taught society to trust documents over memory, custom, or personal power, a shift that made stable governance across large populations possible. The quiet acceptance of borders marked on maps, rather than defined only by rivers or personal loyalty, slowly transformed how people imagined territory, turning land into something abstract, measurable, and governable, which later allowed nation-states to exist. In everyday economics, the routine use of coins with standardized weights and symbols built trust between strangers, reducing the need for barter and enabling markets to expand far beyond local familiarity. The medieval habit of keeping chronicles, often written by monks who simply wanted to record notable events, created a continuous sense of past, present, and future, encouraging societies to learn from precedent rather than starting anew with each generation. Even silence played a role, as monastic traditions of contemplation preserved the idea that slow thinking and reflection had value, quietly resisting a purely reactive or impulsive approach to life. In family life, the Church's insistence on consent in marriage gradually shifted relationships away from pure arrangement toward individual choice, subtly redefining personal agency and emotional bonds. The routine use of seals and signatures as markers of identity and approval introduced visual symbols of authority that reduced impersonation and fraud, laying foundations for modern authentication. Towns that invested in shared infrastructure, bridges, wells, roads, did so for immediate convenience. Yet these collective projects normalized public investment for common benefit, a principle central to modern civic life. Even attitudes toward death quietly reshaped the future, as medieval people developed rituals of burial, remembrance, and inheritance that linked generations, reinforcing long-term thinking about legacy, continuity, and responsibility. None of these decisions were loud, revolutionary, or universally agreed upon. Many were resisted, adapted, or misunderstood. Yet their power lay precisely in repetition, as each choice, once made, became habit, and each habit, once normalized, became structure. By the time the medieval world gave way to new eras, humanity had already been quietly trained to live within systems of law, time, economy, knowledge, and identity that felt natural only because they had grown so slowly. In this way, medieval decisions did not announce the modern world. They rehearsed it patiently and quietly until history itself stepped onto a stage that had already been built. Even after all these layers, the medieval world continued to shape the future through decisions so ordinary that they barely registered as choices at all. When pilgrims set out toward distant shrines, following shared routes and relying on roadside inns, hospitals, and guides, communities along the way adapted to serve them, unintentionally creating early networks of tourism, information exchange, and standardized services that later supported long-distance travel and commerce. The decision by rulers and clergy to tolerate pilgrimage culture, rather than restrict movement, slowly accustomed people to the idea that travel could be purposeful, transformative. And still, the medieval legacy continues to deepen the more patiently one looks, because that era quietly trained humanity to live with life as an ongoing responsibility rather than a solved problem. Medieval people rarely believed they were building something new. They believed they were carrying something fragile. This sense of custodianship shaped how people treated land, institutions, traditions, and even relationships. Nothing felt disposable because replacement was uncertain. When something broke, it was repaired not out of nostalgia but necessity. This attitude slowly embedded the idea that preservation itself was a form of wisdom. Modern civilization, despite its obsession with innovation, still relies on this inherited instinct whenever it chooses maintenance over replacement, reform over collapse. Medieval life also reshaped how humans understood effort. Effort was not tied to immediate reward, visibility, or success. Work continued regardless of outcome. This separated action from validation and trained societies to function without constant reinforcement. People acted because roles existed, not because recognition followed. This discipline allowed large systems to operate without relying on motivation alone. Even today, institutions survive because people perform duties whose benefits are distant, abstract, or invisible. A direct inheritance from medieval endurance. Uncertainty was not treated as an enemy but as a condition of existence. Weather, health, politics, and fortune shifted without warning. And medieval societies learned not to anchor identity to stability. This flexibility prevented psychological collapse when circumstances changed. People expected disruption and planned loosely rather than rigidly. This expectation shaped cultures capable of absorbing shock. Modern resilience strategies echo this ancient understanding. Systems that assume stability fail quickly, while those designed for fluctuation endure. The medieval sense of belonging also trained humanity in coexistence. People lived within overlapping communities. Family, village, guild, faith, none of which fully define them alone. This distributed identity reduced the risk of total collapse when one structure failed. If authority disappointed, community remained. If belief wavered, custom endured. This redundancy created social resilience. Modern societies still depend on layered identity to absorb strain, even as they often underestimate its importance. Time itself was treated as expansive rather than scarce. Without constant urgency, people lived inside duration. Decisions unfolded slowly. Consequences revealed themselves gradually, and patience became a survival skill rather than a moral ideal. This relationship with time discouraged extremes. People learned that rushing often worsened outcomes. Modern systems, legal appeals, scientific review, democratic deliberation still rely on this medieval tolerance for delay, even as modern culture resists it. Medieval societies also normalized the coexistence of strength and fragility. Strength was not expected to be permanent, and fragility was not equated with failure. This balance prevented overconfidence during prosperity and despair during hardship. People understood that stability was temporary but renewable. This cyclical understanding allowed societies to recover repeatedly rather than collapse under disappointment. Modern cycles of boom and recovery follow the same pattern, often without acknowledging its ancient roots. Even morality was shaped by this realism. Goodness was not measured by purity, but by persistence. People were flawed, systems imperfect, outcomes uneven. Yet effort mattered. Repentance, correction, and continuation were valued more than perfection. This ethic shaped institutions capable of reform rather than replacement. Modern ideas of rehabilitation, accountability, and improvement reflect this medieval understanding that failure does not disqualify participation. Silence and waiting were also teachers. Without constant stimulation, people learn to endure boredom, reflection, and anticipation. This internal pacing prevented emotional overload. Modern life struggles with this inherited silence, yet still depends on it whenever focus, patience, or long-term thinking is required. The medieval world trained humanity to sit with discomfort without demanding immediate escape. Perhaps most profoundly, medieval people accepted that meaning was cumulative rather than immediate. Lives were not expected to feel complete. Contribution mattered more than fulfillment. People acted knowing they were adding a small piece to something larger. This humility toward purpose allowed societies to sustain long-term projects without requiring personal payoff. Universities, legal traditions, cultural memory and infrastructure all depend on this willingness to contribute without closure. Conflict, too, was shaped by endurance. Medieval disputes often ended not with resolution but with exhaustion. This taught societies how to stop rather than win. Compromise became a survival skill. Living with unresolved tension proved preferable to endless destruction. Modern diplomacy, ceasefires, and negotiated peace inherit this ancient understanding that survival often requires acceptance rather than victory. Even imagination followed this pattern. Stories emphasized return, consequence, and continuity rather than instant triumph. Heroes endured more than they conquered. This narrative structure trained people to expect complexity rather than resolution. Modern storytelling still follows these rhythms because they reflect lived reality shaped over centuries. The medieval world did not believe in inevitability. It believed in effort. Progress was not guaranteed, but neither was collapse. Everything depended on participation. This belief quietly empowered ordinary people to sustain civilization without needing to understand it fully. Showing up mattered more than certainty. Maintenance mattered more than mastery. Over time, these habits became invisible. They embedded themselves into how humans organize, govern, cooperate, and endure. Modern life often mistakes these foundations for natural order, forgetting they were learned through centuries of uncertainty, repetition, and restraint. The medieval world did not announce its lessons. It practiced them until they became instinct. History tends to celebrate moments of change, but civilization survive through moments of continuation. The medieval age mastered continuation. It taught humanity how to live without answers, how to function without guarantees, and how to endure without illusion. That lesson remains active every time a society chooses repair over rupture, patience over panic, and continuity over collapse. In the end, the medieval world changed everything, not by moving history forward dramatically, but by preventing it from falling apart through countless ordinary decisions, quiet, repetitive, uncelebrated. It trained humanity in the deepest skill of all, how to keep going when the future is unclear. Control is limited, and meaning must be carried rather than found. That skill still holds the world together today. And even after all of this accumulation, the medieval influence still refuses to end, because its deepest transformation was not structural alone, but psychological. Medieval life reshaped how human beings related to uncertainty at the most intimate level. People learned to wake each day without expecting clarity, comfort, or fairness, and yet still participate fully in life. This quiet courage, continuing without assurance, became a cultural reflex. Over centuries, it trained humanity to live without guarantees and still build systems that outlasted individual lives. Modern civilization often assumes confidence is required for action, but medieval life proved the opposite. Action can exist without confidence, and endurance often matters more than belief. Medieval people also learned how to live with delay as a normal condition. Answers came slowly, justice unfolded unevenly, and consequences revealed themselves over years rather than moments. This delay shaped patience not as a virtue to admire, but as a skill necessary for survival. People learned that rushing rarely improved outcomes and often made them worse. This understanding quietly shaped long-form institutions, law, education, religion, governance that still rely on extended timelines, appeals, reviews, traditions, and precedents. All depend on this inherited tolerance for slowness. Without it, modern systems would collapse under their own urgency. The medieval world also taught humanity how to distribute responsibility across time. Decisions were made with the awareness that their full effects would be felt by others. This awareness encouraged restraint. People did not assume they had the right to exhaust resources, traditions, or stability for immediate gain. Even when exploitation occurred, it was often moderated by fear of consequence, memory of past failure, or concern for lineage. This long shadow of responsibility shaped early environmental awareness, inheritance practices, and communal decision-making. Modern sustainability debates echo this ancient intuition that survival depends on what is preserved, not just what is extracted. In social life, medieval people became skilled at navigating ambiguity in relationships. Loyalties overlapped, obligations conflicted, and moral clarity was rarely absolute. Instead of demanding consistency, people learned to operate within contradiction. One could obey authority while resenting it, believe while doubting, belong while disagreeing. This tolerance for internal conflict allowed communities to remain intact despite difference. Modern pluralistic societies depend on this same ability to live with unresolved disagreement, an ability first refined when survival required coexistence.